Nothing Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. Like much in the original Star Wars trilogy, this line of dialogue mystifies and intrigues viewers on the first watch. Is it an overmatched old man's bluff in an attempt to save his life? Or does he know something everyone else doesn't? In many ways, this tension is emblematic of much of Obi-Wan Kenobi's story, a story we're looking at today. All right, so, at our current point in time, which is irrelevant to podcast listeners down the road, there's a new TV series coming out about Obi-Wan Kenobi. So, the first two episodes came out yesterday, so it's too early to tell what's going to happen in it or what it's going to be like or how well done it was. Yeah. But we figured that and I don't think we'll say anything that will be necessarily spoilers on a big level for that, but we'll talk about Obi-Wan Kenobi sort of in his entirety as a character. Yes. I'm trying to think, have we talked about any other fictional characters besides Godzilla?
Well, no, we talked about Obi-Wan and Luke before. Well, I've referred endlessly to Marvel Comics and Star Trek and such.
But I don't think we've done a whole episode on it.
We haven't.
So this will be a little bit of a new ground, but I think that it's something that is intriguing and we'll probably do a lot more of in the future. I know that Godzilla, I really liked Godzilla, and I think that it was very interesting. These characters are very philosophical, and they grow over time. They've grown over the past, 45 years. So yes. It'll be interesting. But we'll start with who is Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Star Wars universe?
In the Star Wars universe, he is a Jedi Knight who becomes a master Jedi over time, and because of this sequence of movies, if you put them in sequence or not, those of us who watched them know the story from when he was young, all the way up until now when he's getting. I don't know how they're going to handle it because it's never going to quite look like Alec Guinness in age. I think Alec Guinness was the old sorcerer. But in the timeline that we're seeing, he's got some gray now. He's getting raggedy a little bit, and it could conceivably happen, but it doesn't matter. See, those details to me that's not an issue. That's the surface details. If that were the case, nobody else could play Obi-Wan Kenobi except Alec Guinness, unless you do a computer-generated image. I'm not into all of that. I think that just like in cartoons or comics, many people draw a character in so many different ways, and that's a collaborative effort. Obi-Wan Kenobi as a character has been a collaborative effort. George Lucas put him out there, but there was a whole lot of thought and discussion about it before that happened. There are other people's input sooner or later, the actor's input. So yeah, he's a Jedi, and part of the Jedi experience, it seems, is that one should not become attached. So it's kind of harkens to a variety of perhaps Buddhism, Zen, but he's a master swordsman, lightsaber fighter, a gymnast, apparently, from some of the force abilities he's able to do in his younger years. We're not seeing that right now.
Yeah, that's what, when I just mentioned like these characters growing, it's probably not more true of anyone than Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Star Wars universe. He's the only, one of the only characters besides R2-D2 and C-3PO and Anakin to appear in the first the first 6 movies in the series, 1 through 6. And outside of that, there's a bunch of what they call expanded universe material where essentially, and, some of it is things that have been, undone by Disney. But then some of it has been refilled in by Disney. So even if you look at it canonically, you still pretty much have a complete view of his life. And it's interesting, right? Because I think it's like you said, our first experience with Obi-Wan is as, you know, the old man, right? The wise old man to Luke Skywalker. But if you sort of look at his life chronologically in the fictional universe, he starts out as a, you know, he's trying to get selected to be a Jedi Padawan. None of the masters want to take him because they see him as being too erratic and too violent, which doesn't really fit in with some of how we think about Obi-Wan.
And I wasn't aware of that part in the exterior. I haven't watched the cartoons. I know I need to. I've read a couple of the novels, but I've never encountered that.
Right. So he's too erratic and aggressive, so none of the Jedi Masters will take him. Finally, Qui-Gon Jinn, who's sort of erratic in his own regard, decides that he'll take him. They have a very tumultuous relationship, and in some cases, they split apart from each other for a brief time. Obi-Wan leaves the Order. He comes back to the Order. They face all kinds of threats and adventures, and they do a lot of important things, and in many ways, because they aren't doing what they're supposed to, because the duo sort of does what they think they need to do, they end up in a lot of situations where they're doing things that the Jedi Order can't carry out on its own. Right. Then we get to the prequel trilogy, which is the tail end of that period of time, and we see Obi-Wan becoming a little bit more reserved, I guess. He's still sort of sarcastic and dry, and, you know, but if you look at him and Qui-Gon in the prequel trilogy, it seems like Obi-Wan is the more reserved one. Qui-Gon is taking a lot more risks. He's acting a lot more like the Maverick. And there's a lot of growth during that time period, right? Obi-Wan goes from being an apprentice to defeating Darth Maul, which in the Star Wars universe was the first Jedi to defeat a Sith Lord in over 1,000 years. So he becomes a rock star within his own universe, right? And he's made a general, you know, of clone troopers, and he takes on this apprentice that's supposed to bring balance to the Force, but the Jedi Order says he's not supposed to train him. So we're back to this Maverick sort of thing.
That's an interesting additional view that I've not.
Yeah,
the youngest, the Qui-Gon kind of story.
So then we obviously Anakin turns to the dark side and, you know, destroys the Jedi Order, and Obi-Wan goes into hiding. And that brings us up to the current series where, you know, it's 10 years after the last prequel movie. And again, I don't think it's spoiling anything too much to say that we're seeing that Obi-Wan has changed over this period of time.
Yes, he has. And this is the fascinating part for me. And I'm not trying to interrupt. This is what I really enjoyed about that first episode. I haven't watched the second one yet. Is that if you want all the slam bang crash eye candy fights, this is not what this is about.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely an attitude, you know, and you can only imagine if you went from being a general and being a Jedi who has accomplished these great things to watching the entire thing come crashing down and you're in hiding. That would probably break your spirit, you know, and that's sort of what we're seeing with him here. And then, you know, we don't know yet what adventures he's going to see over the next 10 years or so, but he emerges to, you know, help Leia, and he decides he's going to train Luke in the original Star Wars series. And we see him getting a little, again, coming back to that sort of maverick trickster sort of ways in some regards, you know. I remember we did an episode on Obi-Wan's hut where he says, you must learn the ways of the Force if you're going to travel with me to Alderaan. And Luke says, travel with you to Alderaan? This is crazy, right? You're like, we can't do that. But he attempts to train Luke, and we get to the scene that I mentioned in the intro where Darth Vader strikes him down, and he becomes a Force ghost that guides Luke through the remainder of the story and eventually to success. So that's sort of Obi-Wan's in-universe story. And
yes, his arc.
Yeah. And so like we're talking about, I'm sure that for many people, that's sort of, it seems dissatisfying or inconsistent, right? Okay, so he goes from being a rebellious child to a more reserved kind of teenager, back to a big confident general, to a broken middle-aged hermit, back into this sort of wise old trickster that guides this. And it seems like, well, none of this is consistent. But really, humans are complex people.
That's exactly it. I know where you're going with this, and that is exactly what makes this kind of thing compelling. Because if a person wants to claim that he or she, they have been the same person all the way through their lives, never done anything different, they're either self-deluded or they've had a very, very, very limited life in which that self-delusion has been encouraged. You can't encounter pain, disaster, defeat, and not be altered by it, and in endless ways. And there's no playbook for that. But of course he's, I don't think you have to be an older person to appreciate this. But as somebody who is in his 60s, and I'm looking at Obi-Wan and thinking back through those movies, which the TV series at the very beginning gives us choice clips from. This is a man who's thinking very carefully about how to slice a piece of meat and doing a factory job that's untenable, and also nursing his wounds, and also trying to keep on mission tasks, which is hard when you are by yourself and have no help with it, and is also shifting his priorities in ways that seemingly sells out or abandons principles that he held sacrosanct in his earlier life. And that's what's compelling.
Yeah. And again, we're into the ship of Theseus thought experiment, right? And I think about my own life, and it kind of up to this point, it's followed a similar arc. Like when I was a child, I had a violent temper, very aggressive and competitive and angry, really. And, I'm not going to delve into the specific details of my life, but there was an experience when I was 8 years old, where my dad sat me down and he said, what you almost did was an extremely bad thing that could have all of these repercussions on your life. And he sat down and just explained to me very calmly and with a lot of love, where this sort of behavior was taking me. And in an instant, there was, it seems like it's the kind of thing that would take a long time to develop. I stopped being angry at that point because he did this such a good job of illustrating where this sort of pattern of behavior was going to take me. And even at that age, I knew that this isn't the kind of person I wanted to be. And so then I was a very quiet, calm child from the age of 8 until about the age of, let's say, 17 or 18 or so. And then became a very confident teenager. And then had a bunch of setbacks in very fast succession that immediately crushed that spirit and sent me into sort of being a recluse for several years, and eventually working my way out of that and having several successes that were earned through a lot of self-development and a lot of learning different things. And this is a very short life, right? And with a lot of contrast and a lot of different, behaviors or personalities that would seem antithetical to each other, certainly, right? Yeah. And so you ask that question, well, have I been the same person my whole life? Or are these different people that we're looking at? So if we can ask that about real people, it's not far-fetched to look at a character, and even if it's somebody who's been developed by several different people and say, well, this seems inconsistent. Well, you look at the circumstances somebody faces in their life and the point in life that they're in, and all of the different factors and things that happen throughout life, and you say, man, almost any swing in personality is possible given the right combination.
That's right. Given
events.
The right circumstances, events, experiences, as you say, that can emerge in a moment and can turn you. Things can happen in moments that turn us. And there's much to me in our current societal moment that I think probably unintentionally in some ways emerged in watching this last night, this first episode, things that go right to the core of pain and horror. And I don't know that Lucas ever intended that either, but that's what makes it human.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't, it could not escape me, with the most recent mass shooting in Texas, or Sandy Hook or whatever. One of the reasons that scene so bothered me, and my son would tell you that I was upset that we were even watching, I had apologized at one point for taking him to see when the original movie, when Darth Vader went in and essentially destroyed the younglings, the Jedis in training. And I realized why it was. It was because of Columbine and all those things that were in my head. It wasn't how I thought the story should be. But last night I'm watching this thinking, and this extended scene where stormtroopers and Vader are mowing down Jedi teachers and going after the younglings who are desperately trying to get away. And I broke into tears. Because, and I'm not, embrace that. I'm not embarrassed by that but I'm just saying that this is the kind of thing that storytelling. Oh, I'm watching a Star Wars story. So yeah, entertainment. But if you're listening and you are watching the scenes, there are things that will connect with you. And here's a man who was a teacher, a general, all of the things, but he was a teacher, and he could not protect his students, and he could not save his own student, and he ended up doing. It's betrayals and pain and hurt and that I think is important to the character.
Yeah. So, who's Obi-Wan Kenobi as a literary or cinematic character then? I think that we've talked about his in-universe sort of story, and this is sort of bled over a little bit, but if we're looking at him from a meta point of view, what kind of character is he?
Well, from a meta point of view, from a literary, a folkloric point of view, he is the guide. Eventually, he is the guide, but he has to go through his own hero quest first, and I think that he's gone through a number. I think he's Joseph Campbell's hero quest has been on the cycle a number of times.
Yeah.
Much like in some ways Merlin, although I would argue that Merlin has fewer cycles. Much like Gandalf, who lives for 5,000 years and has had stories that alluded to, Tolkien wrote some of them, others not. That 5,000 years is a lot of experience, and there were times of withdrawal, and there were times of reclusiveness, and times of really diving in and trying to change the path of Middle Earth in that sequence. So I think he's someone on the hero quest who gets taken right back to the belly of the beast and has to start all over again, crashing and refinding himself.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, and we should do an episode on the monomyth at some point. I think that would be awesome. But it's. I think what's interesting about Obi-Wan is, like you said, when he first appears to us, he's very archetypically the wise old man.
Yeah.
But as we just talked about, going through his character history now, at one point he was an apprentice, a learner. And then at one point he was the leader and, like the, sort of the steadfast kind of, the strong presence in an organization. At another point, he was, a recluse, he wouldn't even necessarily be a wise old man, not in the story that's being told right now, because he's almost refusing to have any part in what's going on. And a lot of his skills have devolved or have been...
Or he perceives them as having. But if you haven't practiced for 10 years, that would happen, wouldn't it?
Right. And that's not something that is really... that I know of, isn't really explored in Jungian archetypes or monomyths, is... you do see it a lot in cinema, right? Is this character that was a hero or was, had some sort of ability and then has sort of been disillusioned or defeated and fades into the background and, has to build back up to what they were to complete another quest.
I think you do, although I'm flashing quickly through my mind. I think that philosophically, when Shakespeare gives us this marvelous speech about the 7 ages of man, right? And that always is fascinating. But you're really getting the 7 ages of Obi-Wan as a man, or Merlin was that way. There was a series called Young Merlin. There was a lovely, wonderful illustrated books about Merlin's adventures as a kid, and then we have the in the arc Merlin aging backward. That becomes part of the tales, and here we're given the old guy, then the young guy, and now we're back to the middle-aged guy again, working toward the old guy. But I can't think of in the comic books, Batman gets his back broken in the third, The Dark Knight Rises. Right? He's put out a commission for a few months, but then he manages to make it back in part with a bat suit, and then he gives it all up. Obi-Wan it's been 10 years. And I think that if this series continues as it looks, as it might, it's not necessarily going to be all the heroic shenanigans that we saw in the middle movies. There were a lot of people I remember talking at that Choo fan spatter about how could that Obi-Wan we saw possibly be in the earlier movies now, the guy who can just so quietly wield the lightsaber with Darth Vader and doesn't do anything particularly fancy. Well, you wouldn't.
Right.
Because even though I love superhero characters, this is not a superhero. This is somebody who is, even Batman ages. Not particularly well sometimes, depending on the comic sequence. You wouldn't expect Obi-Wan to be able to do this. And this is where I think it's different than, and I think from a humanistic and philosophical position, I don't think I'm overstating this. This is where it's different than the actor who played Qui-Gon, whose work I enjoy. But he's still doing movies. He's about 70 and he's still punching people out and everything. And no, Indiana Jones is going to be another movie out, and he's 80. I like Harrison Ford, his work very much, but really, how are we going to do this? And some of the other action adventure stars, I can't think of all the names. I've watched this stuff for years. Where it doesn't matter how old they get, they come out of retirement and they're ready to go again. Mm. Obi-Wan is not.
Yeah, and they even talk about that in universe, where Obi-Wan learned from Qui-Gon Jinn, and part of that was the lightsaber technique, Ataru, which is there's 7 lightsaber techniques. That's the most aggressive one, and so you see that on display when they fight Darth Maul.
Yeah,
and Ataru is what is Qui-Gon Jinn's undoing. That's what gets him killed, and Obi-Wan executed it just a little bit better and defeated Darth Maul. But in the story, after he defeats Darth Maul and sees his master die, that sends a message to him that says maybe this isn't the best way. So he completely switches poles, and he goes to the most defensive lightsaber style. And you see that on display when he's in his later duels against General Grievous or Darth Vader or Anakin on Mustafar, which is essentially no aggressive moves at all. You just become a defensive stronghold, and you just weather blows, and until you can maneuver the battle into a spot that's favorable for you, and you can say, I have the high ground, and your opponent can no longer get past your defenses, and you wait for them to make a mistake. So even within the universe, there's these details that explain that sort of shift. Mm-hmm. And that last battle with Darth Vader is very similar, right? We see Alec Guinness, who, again, he's only supposed to be 57 or 58 or something. There's obviously some continuity problems with that, but he's obviously an older man in the first film. And you can see in his lightsaber battle, he's not making any aggressive moves against Vader. And you can probably argue that from the very beginning of the battle, he had no intention of winning anyways.
Right, he was just buying time.
So, yeah, and again, it's a very interesting thing to examine from a philosophical standpoint. I think that's part of the reason that these characters, like I said with the first line of dialogue in the intro, have had such a powerful impact with people, is because it goes against, as much as the monomyth is being told, there's also things about it that were fresh in Star Wars, with it being told from a sci-fi sort of story that hadn't really been explored before. There was no such thing as a Force ghost, right? Before Obi-Wan got killed. So when he says, you're going to strike me down, I'm going to be more powerful than you can imagine, nobody knows what he's talking about.
Well,
right?
I remember sitting in the movie theater hearing that. And I watched the film more than once, of course, and I'm thinking, what does he mean? That's why your intro worked for me so well. It was 1977? and I'd just gone off to college, and here was this. I'm thinking he's sacrificing himself. That was pretty clear. And I thought, okay, he's doing that to try to throw Darth Vader off. And maybe there is some mystical element. They referred to him as an old sorcerer and so on. So maybe some of that was there. But we had no idea what was coming with that.
Yeah. So does Obi-Wan's story defy archetype? Or do you think that it demonstrates a weakness in thinking of archetypes? Or is there something else going on there?
I don't think it defies archetypes, because archetypes, the more you read, if you read Jung or many, many, many things since, the idea of an archetype is not that it's an emoji. An archetype is a symbol, and symbols run deep if you are willing to investigate them. You might do a soundbite on what a symbol stands for, so to speak, but if you're going to do it any justice, then you really need to read, think, reconsider, and that rewards one's experience of it. I don't think he's against archetype. I think we're now in our media and our storytelling and our narratives, and I think in a much more Odyssean, Homeric form, or tending toward that, just in terms of the scope and length. Homer tells us about the history of the Trojan War, 10 years. And then we have the 10-year quest to return back home for Odysseus. That's 20 years of story. Now, there wasn't a lot of that going on in earlier filmmaking, I think, arguably. It more adhered, if not adhered to Aristotle's unities, which means a certain amount of what happens on the stage should be exactly the amount of time that's happening for the audience, that kind of thing. Well, thankfully, theater broke out of that and cinema. But I think the long game is what people are more interested in now for some reason.
Yeah, you are seeing a lot more of that, and I think that is very interesting because it breeds more complex characters, and it requires more.
It requires more thought if you're going to get into it, so you can question. I sat there thinking, wow, we are really into deontological and consequential duty philosophy in this first episode. Yeah. What is Obi-Wan willing to let happen in order for his mission to be fulfilled? And there are times in the storyline, even of the first episode, that begins to look more like an excuse than a true adherence to duty, because this is a man who is conflicted very much, as you said, about what has happened in the past, about the 10 years of solitude and ignominy that have followed. And, well, hey, I can't go out and help anybody else. I can't help you. You're just going to draw attention to the wrong place. He tells another Jedi practitioner, essentially abandons. And ostensibly feels guilt for the abandonment, but doesn't act on it. It's called to duty and refuses. Hides in the shadows when somebody of import in the story could very easily have been killed in front of him. Doesn't help at all when a civilian is wounded by a villain. And so this paralysis, this deep hesitation, I think, is what's fascinating.
Yeah, and again, it seems completely logical given the story arc that he had with his own Padawan, Anakin Skywalker, right? He was sort of thrust into this role of being master to this Padawan who wreaked this great devastation and destruction despite his best efforts to train him to the opposite, right? And so if you see, your efforts, not just fall by the wayside, but actually result in the destruction of the organization and the ideals that you were espousing, that might be enough. Like you said, there's this interesting thing going on in this first couple episodes where, as you watch Obi-Wan's behavior, you ask, well, is he just attempting to be dutiful to the one task that he has left as a Jedi, or is he afraid? Is he?
And I think it's both.
Right.
And I think that's why it's worthy. Now there'll be people listening to us saying, "Oh, for heaven's sake, this is a piece of pop cultural fluff." Okay, even Alec Guinness was, as I recall, was not terribly pleased to be associated with the character after a bit. But here we have actors who take on the well, I'm sure they're well paid, but I don't think that's the point. Is that they're taking on the characters and script writers and cinematographers and trying to give us more. And I tell you, if it had just been a first episode, I didn't know what to expect. If it had been a first episode where we're right back into out comes the lightsaber, zoom, 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 and everything, I think I would have turned it off. Mm-hmm. Because nothing would have happened in all that time. What? We're just back to being the Obi? No. The fact that they slowed it down, slowed the pace down to minutes, a couple of minutes of watching a camel-like creature with a grand shadow of Obi-Wan on it crossing the desert. Not in a conquering, imperial, colonialist way. Nope, this is a solitude, a figure of solitude. And okay, we've slowed this down. They've put in some complex complications. They've put in some dangers and so on. But I'm with them on this now because they bothered to think about that clash of oppositions. Am I doing my mission? Do I have a duty to do it, or am I just echoing my duty? Am I committed anymore to anything other than my own self-preservation? Must I be preserved in order to follow this mission, or is it fine enough just to let this kid be raised? So that there is a line, and I don't, that's spoiler. There's a line, remember, in the first episode, because I've only seen the one, you've seen two, where when he's talking to Owen, the uncle to Luke, and he tried to leave a toy at night for Luke and some supplies, and Owen brings them back and says, stay away from him. Well, that's all consistent, right? But when he says, essentially, you may not remember the line better, but something about, but I have to train him.
Mm-hmm.
That sounded desperate. Mm-hmm. That didn't sound committed.
Yeah.
That sounded like, if you don't let me do this, then what am I going to do?
Yeah. He said, you remember that we agreed when the time comes, I must train the boy. But as he says it, right? And you think about Star Wars canon, Luke is probably already too old to be starting to train at that. So why hasn't Obi-Wan already started, right? Mm-hmm. And why there's a very obvious confliction, and he is. You can tell he's hanging on to this thread of a former life, and and it trying to convince himself that it's important and it's what he should be doing, but at the same time, he's scared. He's scared about, for all the reasons he should be, based off of what he's experienced this far. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it is a fascinating story. And I think for just a minute, we'll jump outside of the in-universe stuff, because I think that this is a good point to talk about it. You mentioned Alec Guinness, the original actor for Obi-Wan Kenobi. He didn't like the role. He thought the dialogue was bad. He didn't like being remembered for it. He didn't like signing autographs, doing any of that. And Ewan McGregor, the younger Obi-Wan now, really did like it. And he's done some interviews, and it's been fascinating. And I've actually seen articles written online that have sort of backed this up. He said that when they did the prequel trilogies, they thought that they were doing something very important, right? And that those movies were critically panned. And he said that was really hard on him, to think that you did something very, very good and to have it just sort of destroy the modern media. He said, but what he discovered is that the people that the movie was meant for, the 10 and 12 and 14-year-olds in 1999, they had no voice back then. And he said, now, 20 years later, these people are coming up to him and saying, Attack of the Clones is my favorite movie ever, And he said, okay, so what happened is, we got critically panned in the media, people saying, who wants to watch a movie about trade agreements or whatever? But the people, but the people that the movie was meant for, they really liked it. And I was one of them. When The Phantom Menace came out, I was 10 years old. Mm-hmm. And I loved that movie. And I loved Attack of the Clones. And because you want to know what?
My son did too.
I was too young to know how bad the acting was, or, how, even for the time the special effects were good, they were just overdone, right? It was unnecessary to an extent. As a child, you're able to look past all that. You're able to suspend your disbelief, and you're seeing these characters and how they're acting and stuff. And I love those movies, right? And to him, hearing these people as adults tell him that's what made he's the producer on Obi-Wan, the TV series, and you can tell he has this investment in the character, and he wants to see it do well, and I've started to see articles pop up in the news about the Star Wars prequel renaissance has begun, and people reevaluating these things that were just sort of brushed aside, right? It's a cash grab, or it's just badly done, or whatever the case may be, and it recreates. There's this dichotomy, right, where a lot of those criticisms aren't necessarily false, right? But as is a lot of things in life, some of what there is in something is what you're willing to take out of it. right?
That is true, and it points to me as again I've said this to my now adult son many times that I overstepped. When I was becoming moralistic in ways that I look back now and say, what were you doing? I wasn't using I was falling into the rote dad rather than the thinking dad. Not a lot, but enough that how dare I try to co-opt? He and I had enjoyed movies since he could start watching movies, and we shared all these things, Godzilla and all the Clash of the Titans, blah, 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 the old one. And here I was saying, no, this is wrong. And nobody said that to me when I was, a teenager watching Star Wars. I would have decked him. Well, not really, but I would have said, go away, old man, right? Don't tell me what I'm enjoying this. If it's trash, it's trash. I'm still enjoying it. Leave me alone. But I was becoming that voice. And I think some of us of a certain age, we think this character is supposed to be this way. This is where we are wrong and right all at once, but more wrong than right. For us, this character was a certain thing. But we didn't know that the character was going to go on into this, as I say, Homeric long arc. And so for it to do that means that, of course, you have to look at it and say, no, your Obi-Wan is not going to be my Obi-Wan until it's my Obi-Wan again. And now that Obi-Wan is older, he's sort of my Obi-Wan, and maybe he's a younger guy. I don't know how young people are going to be taking this Obi-Wan. It'd be interesting to find out.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes you wonder, what Alec Guinness would think, right? Because at that point, the only interaction he had with Obi-Wan was the one movie that he had done, right? He might still think all of the acting and all the dialogue was garbage or whatever, but maybe the story as a whole, to see the fact that the character got fleshed out and had a background and had different experiences and wasn't just a stock character, because Obi-Wan Kenobi in that first movie, at least in the early stages, was a stock character.
Yes.
Essentially, his meeting with Luke was lifted directly from Lord of the Rings with Gandalf, but he developed over time. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's interesting looking at the background and the things that happen. I think that prequel trilogy was important because Anakin Skywalker is the main character and he's a villain, right? And so that leads to some storytelling that up until that point in time, I'm struggling to think of another film that did that, right? You watch Revenge of the Sith, and it's overwhelmingly, just oppressively sad and dark.
Yeah.
And your main character is turning into the worst villain in a universe, right? In a galaxy.
Yeah.
And that's, it's difficult to watch. And many people question why it was even made, right? Why would we want to watch something like this? But it's powerful. It's kind of powerful.
It was. And it's certainly, it was ahead of its time. And I can say that now because look at it. I won't say endless. The productions that are out there now on any number of streaming channels. There's a show called The Boys, which is a superhero show that I've watched, but it is painful because all the superhero tropes are actually taken apart. But of course they need to be taken apart from time to time. So you say, well, what do we really mean in 2022 when we say vigilante? Because the vigilante in comic books in the 1960s, the word really wasn't even used. And then you start thinking, well, what is a vigilante? Somebody takes the law in their own hands. Yes. That means somebody's not answering to the law. Well, maybe if they're good enough to answer to the law, if the law is should be answerable to, if, and that's a complexity that as a kid, most of us didn't get with Batman or anything else, for heaven's sake. And now it's there. And I think that we are becoming much more sophisticated, potentially, and realizably in things like this show, of going there.
Yeah, I think along with the Homeric sort of extension of these characters' stories, I think that is another big aspect of it. And whether it's art imitating life and what we're seeing happening in the outside world, or whether it's something else, could be up for debate.
Just happens to speak to us because it does.
Yeah, but yeah, you think of Vigilante and you think of Clint Eastwood, right? Yeah. Where he's taking the law into his own hands, but he's right. That. Well,
at least sometimes, I suppose. Right. But
it's gotten much more complex now, and you see that with a character like Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? Because in those prequel trilogies, his allegiance is to the Jedi Order, right? To the Jedi Order. And then all of these bad things happen, and you see him wonder, well, should he have been, dedicated to the Jedi Order the way he was? Would Qui-Gon have continued to be?
Exactly.
It raised all these questions about, well, who is right? Because, essentially, the Jedi and the clone troopers and these good guys turned into the Empire, right? And
right.
And
it slides off. It's so you can watch these things without ever trying to think about this stuff, but I don't think you have nearly the rich experience that you have if you do this. And if we go back to Homer, let's see. Here are people who run off because the king's wife is kidnapped, ostensibly, by Troy, by Prince of Troy, who then is going to but she stays. She doesn't get away, but she stays. But maybe she's in love. Maybe she's adjusted to her life there. Here are all these guys dying and dying and dying and dying. What, to bring her back? And some of them start questioning that. And some of them decide that they want to leave. And then these guys berate each other. And Achilles is a hero who has a hissy fit because people don't treat him as the hero that he is. And then we have Odysseus, who's a master liar, who defeats monsters that way sometimes, but who insults the gods on his way home, and thus takes 10 years to get back, trying to get back to his wife and his son. And in the meantime, losing every single crew member because of sometimes bad decisions that you can see coming, sometimes decisions that just situations that he couldn't handle. And so you have a very complicated hero figure that doesn't fit the nice simple trope. And I think that's why I say this. Homer, I'm not saying that Star Wars is the equivalent of Homer. I'm not interested in false comparisons like that. But the intent of the long story is revealing.
So, do you think that young Obi-Wan Kenobi is Anakin Skywalker's foil? Because you think about it like, okay, so in the prequel trilogies, right, it's almost sort of difficult to come up with who the protagonist in the story is, right? Anakin Skywalker is kind of the main character, but as we just talked about, he's a villain, or at least he becomes a villain. But we see Obi-Wan sort of on a similar arc, but ends up going in a different direction, right? He starts out a Padawan. He becomes a Jedi. He has a lot of successes that draw him towards the light side. And on Anakin Skywalker's side, he also, he starts out the Padawan. He has a lot of, not even necessarily failures, but he has a lot of interactions with the political or social structures, or just the simple fact that he fell in love when he shouldn't. All of these different sort of things that don't come across as evil or necessarily wrong, but lead him on a different path. And they sort of develop sort of opposite. Do you think that describing them as being a foil is an accurate?
I think it is up to a point. And because yes, the two sides of the same coin, so to speak, is very much there, but I think it's gotten muddied now. Who takes action? Who doesn't? Should the action be taken? Shouldn't it? What is your duty? What is not your duty? That's embroiled Obi-Wan now just as much as it was embroiling Anakin, who was sliding off into the very grim future. It doesn't elude me now, having seen this episode again. You start, things click for you sometimes, just in the smallest things. Never occurred to me probably did to a lot of people, not to me, that how Obi-Wan defeated Darth Maul was mirror reversed in his defeat of Anakin in the physical nature of it. Obi-Wan did I'm not sure what the correct term is, but he flips and spins, lands, and wipes out Darth Maul. Anakin flips and spins, and Obi-Wan takes him down. I'm not going to read too much into that, but I think that was a very interesting choreographic choice for a fight scene that maybe meant more than we first thought.
Yeah, like we talked about, that was sort of a defining moment in Obi-Wan Kenobi's life. He defeated a Sith Lord for the first time in 1,000 years. He rose to prominence. But at the same time, within himself, he identified that this aggressive lightsaber style had weaknesses, and he went completely the opposite direction with his lightsaber fighting. And like you're saying, when he knows what Anakin's going to do, because he's seen this before in himself, right? And that does sort of play out in their story arcs, because in the prequel trilogy, Obi-Wan is dedicated to this organization, the Jedi Order and the Republic, whereas Anakin has conflicting loyalties. He's in love with Padme, and he's had bad experiences with the Order and all of this stuff. And then when we get into the trilogy, not sequel or prequel, Obi-Wan, there is no Jedi Order, there is no Republic. So his dedication is to what? To Luke, to Leia. Whereas Anakin has become Vader, and his dedication is to the Empire, to the organization, to this. Obi-Wan has seen this before in himself again. And yeah, that is kind of the arc, and that is sort of the foil or the tension between the two of them, is they are sort of this yin and yang, sort of two sides of the same coin. And that's why it's really fascinating, right? Because Obi-Wan is not the hero. He's not the protagonist, right? And some people, and I was one of them, thought that the sequel trilogy, that Rey was going to be a Kenobi, right? Because that to me seemed to have been where that arc was leading, right? That this is Obi-Wan Kenobi is where that final good was going to triumph over the evil of Anakin Skywalker, and it went a different direction. But I think people came to that conclusion because you can sort of see that happening throughout the movies a little bit.
Yeah, it makes you question and wonder. I mean, these characters, Luke Skywalker in the movie at the end of those movies, in his Force ghosting, in essence, a lot of people did not like the Luke Skywalker that was presented to us, the older 60s plus Luke Skywalker. I did. I had quite a discussion with somebody in my life who found it unacceptable that Luke became the way that he was. And I said, it's perfectly natural. He had what he perceived as a teaching failure. He had a failure not only of teaching, but with somebody in his family that he thought he could do something for, and it didn't work out. So, of course, he's questioning himself. It's the people who don't question themselves who are the real dangers.
Yeah.
And so to me, Luke Skywalker trying to stay, what does he say to Yoda in that last movie that he's, the title is eluding me, Joel. But he's the tree with the Jedi texts is burning, and Yoda's sort of laughing, not maniacally, and Luke's like, but the Jedi texts mean nothing. Suddenly, all of that lore is all about being inside you. This is huge sea change in a couple of lines. Well, I think Obi-Wan is going through this in this show. But what means something? Is it the Jedi text, so to speak, the narrative line of who and what we are? Clearly, not clearly. I was about to say clearly not, but maybe. If you're a Jedi, you're not attached to anything, even other Jedi. You don't owe anything to anybody. you shouldn't be concerned with individuals. That can lead it to a very, very dark path too, can't it? And I think he's wrestling with that.
Yeah, I think it's a line that Obi-Wan says in one of the movies. Only Sith deal in absolutes, right? Yeah. Well, that's an absolute in and of itself, right? So yeah, there's this tension, and it's fun and interesting to think about it in a fantasy sense. But these questions have real implications for real world things like religion or politics or other things. And how people, we talked about spirituality last week, right? Mm-hmm. And I know from experience with religious organizations, right? That people who practice religion or spirituality on their own are generally advised not to do so, right? And the reason for it is because if you're by yourself, you have no, there's almost no rules, right? You have no sounding board against which to test your ideas, right? Like you were just saying, if I am suddenly only following my own guidance, that can lead me into developing thoughts or ideals that may not align with, things that are beneficial to society. But sometimes the organizations themselves aren't setting rules or ideals or beliefs that are have the greatest good in mind.
Questioned whether it's a nation, a community group, that where are we going? What are we doing? Why are we doing this? Where is this coming from? Is this really what we're about? I mean, that's what you're just talking about with the Jedis. It's also about what we're all talking about.
Yeah, and I think that Star Wars in general does a good job of sort of demonstrating that. This sort of tension between, okay, well, do you follow the ideals of the organization? Well, what if the organization's wrong? Well, do you like we're just talking about with the New Republic, it essentially becomes the Empire because they weren't being reflective or they weren't paying attention to what was happening inside their organization. But then Anakin Skywalker is the other end, right? Well, do you listen to yourself? Do you listen to your own ideals and do what you think is right in your own eyes? Mm-hmm. Well, no, because that can lead you on a terrible path.
And that's why
Obi-Wan is at the center of that struggle because he's on his own at one point. He's within the organization at one point, and he's always wrestling with this idea of, well, what is actually...
And he's very hesitant to this call to get out, to go away from the desert and his solitude. Because I think he's probably thinking about those, as you're saying, those things. It doesn't work out so well when you're on your own, but it sure doesn't work so well when you're necessarily staying with the mission either. And do you do what you think is right when you've been trained to do what other people tell you?
So I think the last question we'll ask is, do you think it's always beneficial to have this expanded content? Right? We're getting to this, we talked about the sort of Homeric storytelling. But like we've seen lots and lots in whether it's Marvel or Star Wars or whatever, pick your franchise, right? Everybody is getting into these stories. And I think of different parts of the Star Wars story, right? Like the Book of Boba Fett or some of the content that happens with Darth Maul after he gets killed by Obi-Wan, right? And I think, man, the character sort of loses something, right? I remember watching The Phantom Menace, and after Darth Maul died, thinking, what a waste of a character. He was really cool, really awesome. Like, they should have kept him around. Like, he could have been a big character. But then, essentially, they did do that what is now a non-canonical sense. And he comes back from the dead and he does all this stuff. And then you're like, well, this seems kind of unnecessary. What causes this expanded content to sometimes hurt or water down a character's essence?
Well, that's a different question than you've asked two questions. Is it beneficial? And of course, I'm thinking beneficial to what? To the storytelling or to, yeah. But the second one about watering down the essence. This is harder than it seems, because there are endless resurrections in comic books. If Superman died, they brought him back in a very convoluted way, but he sells comic books. I think somewhere in there, somebody wanted to see what that story would do. How would it play out? And then we've rescued all of that with the multiverse ideas and so much pop culture, going to metaphysics and physics. And okay, so maybe it happens this way here. Maybe it happens that way there. So I don't think it waters it down if any story examines the consequences of an act and follows the change that a character would necessarily undergo because of those consequences. It doesn't water it down. Now, I've been told about Darth Maul. I haven't encountered any of that. Darth Maul comes back and he's just meaner and fiercer than ever. That's not terribly interesting to me, but then you're just bringing somebody back because you want to have him get ripped apart again or something. I don't know. I find that's why I'm not interested in all the Halloween movie things where, okay, we've always got this character. Of course, he's going to come back. Of course, ho hum. So there's really got to be reasons for it that go well beyond the financial for me.
Yeah. I think I'd agree with that. I think that it can become pretty obvious when a company is sort of creating stories for the bottom line. Because really, what is so complex about some of these characters is that it's not the vision of one person, right? And I guess that that's not necessarily true of our lives either, right? Who I am is not a consequence of just me guiding my own ship, as I talked about earlier, right?
No.
I've been several different types of people throughout my life because of circumstances or other people that I've encountered, right?
Right.
So that's also true of fictional characters, right? There's been many different people that have written their story, and there's been many different people that have looked at them. And I guess that what causes a viewer or reader or whatever medium you're in to buy into the realistic nature of this character that exists in a fictional universe set in the future, right? It's already, outside of
way in the past,
right? Yeah, it's already way outside of our personal experience. But in order for us to accept this character, the thread that these different authors are putting together has to resonate with us as real people who have lived in the real world. And I think that a lot of that comes back to the care of the people who are writing it. Right?
Yes. And to extend that again to the lived world, we are collaborations of parents or grandparents or whoever has raised us, of very close relationships, marital or otherwise, workplace, and all the people we encounter. We are collaborations, and people so people who bully somebody over and over and over again have some accountability ultimately for something that might take place because of that. Not ultimate accountability, but their hands are dirty. And anybody who trashes somebody and then that person gets hurt have led to that. And I think these stories, if paid attention to, like Obi-Wan, teach us, or teaching us too didactic, remind us of the utter power of the momentary association, or the stumbled into this, or said that off the cuff, and what that can lead to.
Yeah, and like we talked about, you see that with Obi-Wan and Anakin's interactions, right? In the lightsaber battle on Mustafar, when he knows Anakin's going to do essentially the same move that he did to defeat Darth Maul, but he's seen it before. Or, when Obi-Wan's death scene, right? Well, Vader says, last time we met, you were the master and I was the apprentice, but now the roles are reversed, right? Well, I think that,
that was an arrogant statement in itself because, he's still the master.
Right. He knows, he sees, he already has something up his sleeve that he's in. It's just, it's fascinating. And I think that's what ultimately makes or breaks these characters is the people who are writing the stories, right? But also, like you were saying, our own personal experiences and how we view them. Like you said, when you watched the prequel trilogies the first time, you had a different experience of them than you do now.
Yes.
Same thing with me watching, anything else, right? I have some of these these immediate negative thoughts or experiences, right? But then when I really sit down and start to digest some of them, I think, well, you know what? Actually, this does make sense, or I can see the reason behind it. It doesn't mean that all media is good media, right? There's some badly written things. There's some things that are terrible. But like we said, there's a lot of things where what you get out of it is what you put into it, right? If you're just expecting entertainment, and I think
be entertained. There's nothing. There's not a horrible thing to be entertained.
But like you're saying, this first episode of Obi-Wan, right? There's no action, right? There's nothing happens in that regard. So maybe being entertained, what that means, right? Or what you're looking to get out of something, is going to determine whether or not it's successful. But yeah, man, it's been a lot of fun talking about Obi-Wan. I definitely want to talk about some more fictional characters in the future, and looking at the monomyth for sure. That's something we should have a whole episode on. So until next time, keep on.